The morning started like any other. But by sunset, David Martinez would be facing criminal charges, his reputation in ruins, and his property at the center of a legal nightmare that would expose the dark underbelly of suburban power politics. David Martinez had worked jobs for 15 years to afford his dream home in Willowbrook Estates, a modest 3-bedroom house with a crown jewel that made every sacrifice worth it. A pristine kidney-shaped pool nestled in his backyard. The crystal-clear water reflected the morning sun as David performed his daily ritual, testing the chlorine levels and skimming leaves with the same dedication a curator might show a priceless painting. At 42, David was a man who believed in boundaries, both literal and metaphorical. His 6-foot privacy fence wasn't just about keeping neighbors out. It was about preserving the sanctuary he'd built for his family. His wife Maria often joked that he loved that pole more than her. And David would smile, knowing she understood. It represented something deeper, proof that a janitor's son could build something beautiful. The trouble began on a sweltering Tuesday in August when the doorbell rang with unusual persistence. David opened the door to find Karen Whitfield, the self-appointed queen of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, standing on his porch with a clipboard and the kind of smile that immediately put him on guard. "David, sweetie," Karen began, her voice dripping with false warmth, "I hope you're having a wonderful day. I'm here about our upcoming back-to-school pool party for the neighborhood kids." David's grip tightened on the door handle. "I'm sorry. What pool party?" Karen's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "Oh, don't be silly. The HOA voted last week. We're using your pool for the community event. It's all perfectly legal. Check your covenant. Section 1 to be clearly states the recreational facilities can be designated for community use when it serves the greater good of the neighborhood." The words hit David like ice water. He'd read his HOA agreement dozens of times, but Karen was referencing sections and subsections with the confidence of someone who'd memorized every loophole. "Karen, that's my private pool. I never agreed to." The vote was unanimous among board members. She interrupted, making notes on her clipboard. "We'll need access starting Friday for setup. The party's Saturday from noon to 6. Don't worry. We'll have it professionally cleaned afterward." David felt the blood drain from his face. "You can't just take someone's property." Karen's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "Oh, David, sweet. Naive David, you really should read the fine print more carefully. This is a community, not your personal kingdom." After she left, David spent hours poring over every document related to his property purchase. The covenant was dense, filled with legal jargon that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify, but buried deep in Section 1 to be. He found in a clause that allowed the HOA board to designate recreational facilities for community benefit under special circumstances. The language was vague enough to drive a truck through, and David realized with growing horror that Karen had been planning this for months. She'd waited until the height of summer, when his pool would be most appealing, when the neighborhood kids would be most excited, when saying no would make him look like the villain. That evening, David sat by his pool with Maria, watching the underwater lights create dancing patterns on the surface. "She can't just do this," Maria said. But her voice lacked conviction. She already has. David replied quietly. Question is, what am I going to do about it? For 3 days, David researched, called lawyers, and tried to find a way out of Karen's trap. The legal fees alone would cost more than his car. And every attorney gave him the same grim assessment. Technically, Karen was operating within the bounds of the covenant. Regardless of how morally questionable her tactics were, Friday morning arrived with a parade of trucks. Rental companies delivered tables, chairs, and a massive inflatable bounce house. Karen supervised with military precision, directing workers to set up what looked less like a children's party and more like a neighborhood festival, all centered around David's pool. That's when David made the decision that would change everything. At 11:47 p.m. on Friday night, as the neighborhood slept, David activated his pool's drainage system. The powerful pumps worked through the night, and by morning, his beautiful pool was nothing more than an empty concrete basin surrounded by party decorations that now looked absurd and pathetic. Saturday arrived with chaos. Karen's scream could be heard 3 blocks away when she discovered what David had done. Within an hour, she'd called the police, the mayor, and what seemed like every news station in the city. This is sabotage, she shrieked at the responding officers. He's destroyed community property. This is malicious destruction and terrorism. David stood in his kitchen window, watching Karen gesture wildly at the empty pool while disappointed families gather on his lawn. Part of him felt terrible about the kids' disappointment, but a larger part felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of taking back control. At 2:17 p.m., Detective Ray Morrison knocked on David's door with an arrest warrant. The charges read like something from a crime thriller: criminal mischief, destruction of community property, conspiracy to commit fraud, and most shocking of all, domestic terrorism under a post-9/11 statute that Karen had somehow convinced the prosecutor to invoke. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, David realized that emptying his pool hadn't ended his problem with Karen Whitfield. It had declared war. The Millfield County Jail wasn't designed for middle-aged homeowners whose only crime was standing up to neighborhood bullies. David spent 18 hours in a cell that smelled of disinfectant and desperation, sharing space with drunk drivers and petty thieves who looked at him with confusion when he explained why he was there. You drained your own pool. His cellmate, a man named Rico, arrested for shoplifting, asked with genuine bewilderment, and they arrested you for terrorism. The absurdity of it all might have been funny if David's life wasn't hanging in the balance. The domestic terrorism charge carried a potential sentence of 20 years in federal prison, 20 years for emptying his own pool. Maria's face was streaked with tears when she picked him up Sunday morning. The bill had cost them their entire savings, $15,000 that Karen's legal maneuvering had essentially stolen from their family. As they drove home, David saw the aftermath of Saturday's disaster. His yard trampled, garbage scattered across his property, and a handwritten sign taped to his mailbox that read "Community Enemy" in Karen's distinctive handwriting. The neighbors won't even look at me, Maria whispered. Mrs. Chang crossed the street when she saw me coming. The Johnsons pulled their kids inside when I walked by. Karen's telling everyone you're some kind of dangerous criminal. David's hands shook as he unlocked his front door. Inside, their answering machine blinked with 47 messages, death threats, legal notices, and a handful of supporters who'd seen the news coverage and recognized Karen's tactics from their own knee. IGHBOR hoods. The one message that mattered came from Sarah Chen, not the neighbor who'd crossed the street to avoid Maria, but a lawyer who'd grown up in a similar situation and recognized injustice when she saw it. Mr. Martinez. Her voice was calm and professional. I saw your story on the news. I specialize in HOA disputes and civil rights violations. If you're interested in fighting this, call me. The first consultation is free, and I think we might have more options than you realize. Sarah Chen's office was a cramped space above her Chinese restaurant. Her law degree sharing wall space with family photos and community service awards. She was younger than David expected, maybe 35, with the kind of intensity that suggested she'd never back down from a fight worth having. Show me everything, she said, spreading David's documents across her desk. Every email, every covenant, every piece of communication you've had with the HOA board. For 2 hours, Sarah dissected Karen's strategy with surgical precision. The domestic terrorism charge was prosecutorial overreach designed to intimidate. Sarah was confident they could get it dismissed, but the real revelation came when she discovered something David had missed in his research. Look at this, Sarah said, pointing to a line buried in the Covenant's amendment history. Section 1-B was added in March of this year, 3 months ago, and look who proposed it. David leaned forward, reading the name that made his blood run cold. Karen Whitfield, board president. She wrote this section specifically to target your pool. Sarah continued. But here's what's interesting. HOA amendments require a 30-day notice period and a community vote with at least 60% participation. Did you receive any notice about this amendment? David shook his head. He would have remembered something that important. Sarah's smile was sharp as a blade. Then this entire clause is legally invalid. She's been operating under fraudulent authority. The next week became a whirlwind of legal maneuvering and investigation. Sarah filed motions to dismiss the criminal charges while simultaneously preparing a civil lawsuit against Karen and the HOA board for fraud, harassment, and violation of David's civil rights. But Karen wasn't backing down quietly. She organized a neighborhood petition to have David evicted from the community, started a whisper campaign about his violent tendencies, and somehow convinced 3 neighbors to file restraining orders claiming they felt threatened by his presence. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: David's security cameras. He'd installed the system 2 years earlier after a break-in attempt. 4 discrete cameras that covered his backyard and front entrance. David had forgotten about them during the chaos of the pool party, but Sarah immediately recognized their potential value. We need that footage, she told him urgently. Everything from the week leading up to the party, especially any interactions with Karen or HOA board members. David spent an entire night downloading and reviewing hours of footage. Most of it was routine: him cleaning the pool, Maria gardening, neighborhood cats wandering through their sprinkler system. But at 2:14 a.m. on Thursday night, 2 days before the party, The cameras captured something extraordinary. Karen Whitfield was in his backyard. The infrared footage showed her moving carefully around his pool, taking measurements and photographs. She spent nearly an hour examining his filtration system, even opening the equipment panel and taking pictures of the pump controls. Most damning of all, the audio picked up a phone conversation where Karen discussed contingency plans. If David doesn't cooperate, we'll just drain it ourselves if we have to. Karen's voice was crystal clear in the recording. I know how his system works now. We'll make it look like equipment failure. Maybe even blame him for sabotage when the party gets ruined. Sarah watched the footage 3 times, her excitement growing with each viewing. David, do you realize what this means? She was planning to drain your pool herself and frame you for it. You just beat her to it. But there was more. The cameras had also captured Karen meeting with Detective Morrison in David's driveway the morning after the party, a full hour before David was arrested. The conversation was partially obscured, but lip-reading software revealed enough to be devastating. Karen had fed Morrison false information about David's history of threats and unstable behavior, none of which was true. She orchestrated this entire thing, Sarah said, pacing her office like a caged tiger. The fraudulent covenant amendment, the illegal entry, the false police report. This isn't about a pool party. This is about Karen Whitfield systematically destroying you to cover up her own crimes. As Sarah prepared for the legal battle ahead, David felt something he hadn't experienced since this nightmare began. Hope. But Karen had one more surprise waiting. And when it came, it would test everything David thought he knew about justice, community, and the price of standing up to power. The anonymous package arrived on a Thursday evening, containing photographs that would change everything. Judge Patricia Hendricks had seen every kind of case in her 22 years on the bench, but the sight of a packed courtroom for what started as a neighborhood pool dispute was a first. Media representatives filled the back rows. Sketch artists positioned themselves for optimal views, and what seemed like half of Willowbrook Estates had called in sick to attend the proceedings. David sat beside Sarah Chen at the defendant's table, trying to ignore the whispers and stares from the gallery. Behind them, Maria gripped his shoulder whenever particularly harsh accusations flew across the aisle. Karen Whitfield commanded her own section, surrounded by board members and supporters who treated the proceedings like a social event. Prosecutor James Fletcher stood to deliver his opening statement with the confidence of a man who'd never lost a case he cared about winning. He was Karen's cousin, a fact that should have disqualified him, but somehow hadn't, and his personal investment in the outcome was written across his face. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Fletcher began, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority. This case is about more than a drained pool. It's about the very fabric of community. About what happens when one man's selfishness threatens the safety and well-being of an entire neighborhood. Fletcher painted David as a dangerous recluse who'd escalated a simple community request into acts of vandalism and terrorism. He spoke of disappointed children, ruined celebrations, and the fear that now gripped Willowbrook Estates because of David's unhinged behavior. The defendant didn't just drain his pool, Fletcher continued, gesturing dramatically toward David. He declared war on community itself. He put children at risk by creating attractive nuisance conditions. He destroyed community property, violated multiple HOA covenants, and when faced with reasonable consequences, he lashed out with the kind of extremist behavior we've seen too often in today's fractured society. Sarah's opening statement was a masterclass in controlled fury. Your Honor, members of the jury, what you're about to hear is not the story of community versus individual selfishness. This is the story of how power corrupts, how legal systems can be weaponized by those who believe themselves above the law, and how one family's fight for basic property rights exposed a conspiracy that reaches into the very heart of local government. She outlined the fraudulent covenant amendment, Karen's illegal trespassing, and the systematic campaign of harassment that had driven David to defend his own property. By the end of this trial, you'll see that David Martinez didn't commit terrorism, he exposed it. The first day of testimony focused on the events of that Saturday morning. Karen took the stand wearing a navy suit that projected both authority and victimhood. Her testimony was a carefully crafted performance, complete with tears, when she described the trauma of seeing the empty pool and the devastation of the children's disappointment. I've dedicated my life to building community, Karen said, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. I've organized charity drives, coordinated neighborhood watch programs, and worked tirelessly to maintain property values for everyone's benefit. What David did wasn't just an attack on me, it was an attack on everything we've built together. Under cross-examination, Sarah methodically dismantled Karen's narrative. She presented the fraudulent covenant amendment, complete with forged signatures and backdated documents. She revealed that Karen had never held a proper vote on using David's pool, instead relying on a casual conversation with two board members at a coffee shop. Double quotes Mrs. Whitfield, Sarah said, her voice cutting through Karen's deflections. Isn't it true that you personally profited from previous community events by charging vendors for space and keeping the proceeds? I resent the implication. It's not an implication. It's a question that requires a yes or no answer. Judge Hendricks leaned forward. Answer the question, Mrs. Whitfield. Karen's mask slipped completely. Sometimes there are administrative costs that need to be covered. Someone has to pay for these events. The anonymous package David had received contained financial records showing Karen had embezzled over $40,000 from HOA funds over 3 years, using fake events and fraudulent expenses to cover her theft. Sarah had spent weeks verifying the documents, and they were absolutely authentic. But the most devastating moment came when Sarah played the security footage of Karen trespassing in David's backyard. He courtroom fell silent as Karen's own voice filled the room, discussing plans to drain the pool herself and blame David for the sabotage. That recording is illegal. Fletcher objected desperately. Obtained without proper consent, Your Honor, Sarah replied calmly. This footage was recorded on my client's private property by his own security system. Mrs. Whitfield had no reasonable expectation of privacy while committing criminal trespass at 2 a.m. Judge Hendricks allowed the evidence, and the jury watched Karen's face cycle through emotions as her own words condemned her. Several jurors took notes when Karen discussed her contingency plans in her intention to frame David for equipment failure. Detective Morrison's testimony proved equally damaging to the prosecution. Under oath, he admitted that Karen had provided him with false information about David's history of violence and unstable behavior. When pressed for specifics, Morrison couldn't cite a single instance of aggressive behavior from David because none existed. Detective Morrison, Sarah asked during cross-examination, "How many times have you arrested someone for draining their own pool?" "This is the first time." And the domestic terrorism charge, whose idea was that Morrison shifted uncomfortably. The prosecutor felt it was appropriate given the community impact, but Mrs. Whitfield specifically requested that charge during your initial conversation. Didn't she? Fletcher's objection was overruled, and Morrison was forced to admit that Karen had indeed pushed for the most serious charges possible, including suggestions about federal involvement and Homeland Security concerns. The third day of testimony brought surprise witnesses that Sarah had kept hidden until the perfect moment. 3 former board members came forward with their own stories of Karen's intimidation tactics and financial irregularities. Each had been driven from their positions after questioning Karen's increasingly authoritarian behavior. "She runs the HOA like her personal fiefdom," testified former Treasurer Robert Kim. "Question her spending, and suddenly you're facing violation. Notices for grass length or mailbox colors cross her completely, and she'll make your life hell until you move away." The pattern was clear. Karen had systematically eliminated anyone who might challenge her authority, creating an environment where her word was law and dissent was crushed through legal harassment. But Karen still had one card to play, and she saved it for the final day of testimony. Taking the stand in her own defense, Karen dropped a bombshell that caught even Sarah off guard. David's pool wasn't just any pool, it was built in violation of city setback requirements and had never received proper permits. According to Karen's research, the entire structure was illegal and should have been condemned years ago. "I was trying to help David," Karen testified with renewed confidence. The city was planning to cite him for the unpermitted construction. By using the pool for a community event, I was hoping to demonstrate its value and help him fight the violation. The lie was so audacious, so perfectly crafted, that several jurors actually nodded along. Fletcher seized on this new narrative, painting Karen as a misunderstood community servant trying to save David from his own mistakes. Sarah spent the evening frantically calling city officials and building inspectors, trying to verify or debunk Karen's claims, which she discovered would turn the entire case on its head and reveal the true depths of Karen's manipulation. The morning of closing arguments arrived with an electricity that seemed to charge the very air in Judge Hendrick's courtroom. David had barely slept, his mind racing through all the possible outcomes. Sarah sat beside him with the calm confidence of someone holding an ace up her sleeve. But she'd been mysterious about her final strategy, telling David only to trust the process. Prosecutor Fletcher delivered his closing argument with the passion of a televangelist, weaving Karen's last-minute revelation about permit violations into a narrative that portrayed her as a community saint trying to save David from government persecution. Ladies and gentlemen, we've heard testimony about Mrs. Whitfield's alleged financial improprieties and trespassing. Fletcher began. But we must not lose sight of the central truth. She was trying to protect Mr. Martinez from the consequences of his own illegal construction. Yes, her methods were unorthodox, but her heart was in the right place. Meanwhile, the defendant responded to community outreach with acts of sabotage and destruction that terrorized an entire neighborhood. Fletcher's voice rose with righteous indignation as he painted David as an unstable individual who'd escalated a civil dispute into criminal behavior. This case isn't about property rights or HOA disputes. It's about the rule of law and what happens when someone decides they're above community standards and basic human decency. Sarah stood for her closing argument carrying a manila folder that she placed carefully on the podium. Her voice was steady, almost conversational, as she began to unravel the final threads of Karen's deception. Members of the jury, over the past week you've heard a lot about community values, property rights, and the rule of law. But what you're really witnessing is the conclusion of a 3-year criminal conspiracy orchestrated by some man who twisted those very concepts to serve her own greed and need for control. Sarah opened the folder and removed a document that made Karen visibly pale. Yesterday evening, I received this building inspection report from the city. David Martinez's pool was built in 2019 with all proper permits, passed every required inspection, and is in full compliance with all municipal codes. Not only is Mrs. Whitfield's testimony about permit violations completely false, but the city inspector who signed off on the pool's construction has confirmed that no violations have ever been filed against Mr. Martinez's property. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Fletcher jumped to his feet, objecting that the evidence hadn't been properly disclosed. But Judge Hendricks had already reviewed the documents during the morning recess and ruled them admissible as rebuttal evidence to Karen's surprise testimony. But here's what's truly shocking, Sarah continued, removing a second document from her folder. This is a building permit application filed 3 weeks ago by Mrs. Karen Whitfield for the installation of a swimming pool at her own residence. The same size, same configuration, and the same contractor that built David's pool. The implication hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt. Karen hadn't just wanted to use David's pool for a party, she'd been planning to steal his pool design, his contractor connections, and his entire backyard oasis for herself. Sarah presented phone records showing dozens of calls between Karen and pool contractors, landscape designers, and permit offices. The timeline revealed that Karen had been planning her own pool installation for months, using the HOA party as reconnaissance to study David's setup firsthand. Mrs. Whitfield didn't trespass in David's backyard to plan sabotage, Sarah explained. To the stunned jury, she was conducting industrial espionage, stealing design ideas and technical specifications for her own construction project. When David discovered her unauthorized access and drained his pool to protect his property, he inadvertently exposed a conspiracy that goes far beyond HOA politics. But Sarah wasn't finished. The manila folder contained one more devastating revelation. 3 days ago, acting on information provided by concerned citizens, the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division executed a search warrant on Mrs. Whitfield's residence and HOA offices. What they found was evidence of a systematic embezzlement scheme that has defrauded Willowbrook Estates residents of over $200,000 over 5 years. Karen's supporters in the gallery began looking at each other with dawning horror. Fletcher's face had gone ashen as he realized his case had just collapsed into a sinkhole of corruption and fraud. Sarah detailed the embezzlement scheme with clinical precision. Karen had created fake vendors, inflated maintenance costs, and skimmed money from community fees through a network of shell companies. The pool party wasn't just about stealing David's design, it was meant to generate receipts and invoices that would help her laund. Or another $15,000 in stolen HOA funds. David Martinez didn't commit terrorism when he drained his pool, Sarah concluded. He committed an act of self-defense that inadvertently exposed one of the most sophisticated HOA fraud schemes RC Immunity has ever seen. Mrs. Whitfield didn't want David's pool for the children's party, she wanted it for herself, and she was willing to destroy his life to get it. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous on all counts. Not guilty. But the real drama was just beginning. As Judge Hendricks dismissed the charges against David, FBI agents entered the courtroom with an arrest warrant for Karen Whitfield. The woman who had orchestrated his legal nightmare was led away in handcuffs, charged with embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering under the RICO Act, the same law typically used against organized crime. Families, Fletcher, faced with overwhelming evidence of his cousin's crimes and his own prosecutorial misconduct, resigned from the district attorney's office the following week. Detective Morrison was suspended pending an internal investigation into his handling of the case. The courtroom emptied slowly, with former Karen supporters now avoiding eye contact and mumbling apologies to David and Maria. Several neighbors approached with genuine remorse, admitting they'd been caught up in Karen's manipulation and promising to make amends. Outside the courthouse, David stood with Maria and Sarah, watching news crews pack up their equipment. The pool that had started this entire nightmare was already being refilled. City workers had volunteered their time to help restore what Karen's conspiracy had tried to destroy. What happens now? Maria asked, still processing the day's revelations. Sarah smiled, but there was a predatory edge to her expression. Now, we sue everyone involved in this conspiracy for civil rights violations, defamation, and emotional distress. Karen's personal assets, the HOA's insurance coverage, the prosecutor's office, they're all liable for what happened to your family. David looked up at the courthouse steps where he'd been arrested 3 months earlier, then back at his lawyer who'd saved not just his freedom, but his faith in justice itself, and Karen's pool. He asked, funny thing about that, Sarah replied. When the FBI searched her house, they found that her permit application was based on fraudulent surveys and illegal variances. The city revoked her building permit yesterday. Turns out, her property doesn't meet setback requirements for pool construction. 6 months later, David hosted the neighborhood's real back-to-school pool party in his own backyard. The event raised money for a legal defense fund to help other homeowners fight HOA corruption. Karen Whitfield was serving 18 months in federal prison and facing restitution payments. that would take decades to complete. But the story's final twist came in a letter David received from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Karen's case had opened a nationwide investigation into HOA fraud that had already resulted in 47 arrests across 12 states. David's decision to drain his pool hadn't just saved his property, it had exposed a network of corruption that had been stealing from communities across America. As David read the letter by his pool on a warm autumn evening, he realized that sometimes the best way to preserve what you love is to be willing to lose it all fighting for what's right. The water sparkled in the sunset, reflecting not just light, but the truth that had finally surfaced from the depths of suburban deception. The pool party was over. Justice had finally learned to swim. If you're still here, I'd really like to know what this reminded you of or what you would have done in my place. And hey, if this story hits something in you and you want to support the channel, that little thanks button's always there. Thanks for hanging out. We're HOA Headache Stories, and this is just one of many unbelievable tales. Catch more by checking out the next video. We promise it's even wilder.